Hi, welcome to Blogging Heads TV. I'm your host, Aryeh Cohen-Wade. This is Culturally Determined. And my guest today is Micah Uetricht. Micah, could you introduce yourself?
Sure. I am the managing editor of Jacobin magazine, which is a socialist quarterly. I mostly do stuff online. And I'm also the host of our podcast called The Vast Majority. And maybe most relevant for the purposes of this conversation, I am the co-author with Megan Day, who's a Jacobin staff writer, of a forthcoming book from Verso called Bigger Than Bernie: How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism.
Great. So thank you for coming on today. So the genesis of this episode was I was thinking about, the space on Twitter that the people I follow, it's mostly Bernie people and pro-Bernie people if they've declared an allegiance, and some Warren people, and then maybe a smattering of other types of people. But those are the main two groups that are kind of fighting on, left to center left Twitter, I would say. And if I'm torn between these two camps in some ways, I think if the election were today, I would vote for Warren. So I'm obviously not super enthusiastic about that yet. And there are things about Bernie that I like. I actually voted for Bernie in 2016 after a failed attempt to write in someone else's name on the ballot for the primary in New York State, where the old man there told me I couldn't do that. So I said, okay, I'll just vote for Bernie then.
Who did you want to write in?
I wanted to write in former New Jersey Senator Bill Bradley as a protest vote. I grew up in New Jersey, and I'm actually in New Jersey now. I was definitely anti Clinton in the primary, but also thought that Bernie was running kind of like a protest campaign that just happened to take off, and I didn't think he was. I wasn't ready to embrace him, and at the time I foolishly thought that basically anyone would defeat Trump. Maybe the Democrats selected the one person who couldn't defeat Trump. We'll never know. Or maybe we will know if Bernie gets the nomination this time. So anyways, that's my history. And, I'm not a leftist. I'm not a socialist. So probably I would say leftists and socialists also don't make up the majority of, or even a significant minority of the Democratic primary electorate. It's probably more like people who are kind of into Joe Biden or something like that. And the one other point I wanted to note, this isn't really a point, but factoid, there's a poll that came out this morning from CNN, and Biden has 34% of the Democratic vote. He's somehow hit a new high. Warren and Sanders are tied at 19, or effectively tied at 19 and 16. And then we have Mayor Pete and Senator Harris behind with 6. So in some ways, the fight between Warren and Biden, at least in the online world, seems like the fight to the death. But maybe Biden is secretly running away with this thing while the people on the center left and the left are going after each other. So that's one thing I want to talk about. But let's start with, why should someone who's leaning towards Warren, Bernie curious, why do you think someone like me should vote for Bernie?
Well, I guess I would first ask you what it is that makes you lean towards Warren rather than Bernie to begin with.
Right. Well, I mean, she seems these are the boring things that would get you mocked on Twitter. She seems more realistic.
This is a safe space. Don't worry.
Okay, I'm glad. She seems more realistic about her plans and what it could possibly take to get them enacted, whereas Bernie seems like more pie in the sky about coming up with plans that would be great if you could maybe would be great if you could snap your fingers and they would exist, but I think would be harder and impossible to actually implement. So something like Medicare for all, I think if we could snap our fingers and have universal health coverage instantly, I think that would be great. And that would be a huge improvement in living conditions and quality of life for all Americans. It seems almost impossible to me that this will happen, in the next 20 years even. I'm remembering the crazy fight over Obamacare, which was really an incremental reform that included carve-outs for all the various interest groups that are involved in healthcare. And they were all behind it. Even still, it barely passed. It was almost gutted by the Supreme Court. It's still being fought over today. They're still trying to repeal it. So if that was this giant effort that, was like half a loaf or less and barely passed and might even still be undone in some crazy way because, Federalist Society judges are going to pick it apart in some way we haven't even thought of, then like Medicare for all and making that like first priority, like in like jumping back in the crazy pool of healthcare politics voluntarily, like that was that was very dangerous for Obama, but he got something passed. It was very dangerous for Trump when he tried to repeal it. Just like messing in this world at all is fraught and goes in strange directions. And yeah, so I don't know. So it sounded like that on multiple levels. There are some other like specific Bernie qualms I have about his age and so forth. So yeah.
So I hear what you're saying on this stuff, and I guess following with the example of healthcare, we have seen what it looks like when you advance even a tepid set of reforms to our healthcare system in a progressive direction, which was what Obamacare was, with all these carve-outs, with all these things that you mentioned that were less than ideal, especially for those of us who want Medicare for all. But even with that sort of tepid approach to or tepid attempt to change our healthcare system, we still got just this foaming at the mouth reactionary backlash from the right, which is seemingly their strategy on everything at this point, right? I mean, like any kind of reform that you're going to try to put forward in a progressive direction in American society will be met with this kind of backlash. We, of course, remember the accusations of Obama being a socialist and all of that. And so for me, what feels, what actually seems realistic in terms of winning the kinds of progressive changes that we want to see are not running from that fight, not pretending like there's some, one weird trick that we can do to avoid entering into that battle, but that is the sort of stuff of politics, especially in America, especially in the 21st century. And Bernie is the one who is most unafraid to jump into that fight and to put forward a really bold and uncompromising moral and political vision that sort of, that says that he embraces the kind of FDR style rhetoric of I welcome their hatred, and whether it's the health insurance companies or whether it's the right. He is sort of rearing to go for that fight. And for me, we've seen that when you're not rearing for that fight, we've seen what the right wing backlash can do for you. And so that kind of bold and uncompromising stance that's ready to go into battle against the forces that want to stop progressive change from happening is what we need in American politics right now in order to transform in a progressive direction. And we're getting that so much more from Bernie Sanders than any other candidate, including, I would say, Elizabeth Warren.
Mm-hmm. I guess I would just respond, so, Obama, when he came in, well, it was this moment of crisis with the financial collapse, but also he was trying not to be a scary, far left person. Like he was accused of everything possible. But he, in his manner, in the policies he pursued, the people he appointed, perhaps to his detriment, appointing Clinton Secretary of State, elevated her in order so that she could run for president years later. But yeah, he was center left to center. And so I guess he was able to get some things passed, but not, he didn't really act boldly. Now, I mean, what's the last time there was real bold legislation in America? I guess it would be the Johnson civil rights stuff. I mean, and before that you would say, I guess, the New Deal, both of those were kind of crisis moments. And, there was big success, but also huge pushback by the Supreme Court and by the states, so forth. So I don't know if it's just like going big, going bold, saying yes, Medicare for all, yes, like private insurance will be outlawed or whatever the exact statement is, if that's, you could go big and get nothing because, we still have the filibuster. I want to ask you about what Bernie actually thinks of the filibuster. I'm a little unsure. He seems to have some sort of like one weird trick, actually, way to get around it. But these, people who are in the Senate for a long time often come to embrace its bizarre traditions, and he seems to be fine with the filibuster. So the Democrats are not going to have 60 votes in the Senate, no matter what happens. And so Mitch McConnell will probably still be there, and he'll be doing everything possible to stymie the efforts of whoever the president is, if it's a Democrat. And we're still stuck with this crazy constitutional system that gives everyone knows the way it distorts the will of people. So unless we're thinking like the revolution actually is going to be overturning some of these things, which seems unlikely, then like how do you actually get any of this stuff accomplished?
Well, let me just first go back to what you first said about the New Deal and the Johnson administration civil rights era being the last time that we saw sort of, massive transformative change in this country. Both of those periods were times when we not only had, it wasn't just that we had some kind of, president in FDR or in Johnson that were uniquely willing to fight for progressive change. I mean, obviously it did matter that they were in office as opposed to like open reactionaries. But those periods were periods that were marked not just by who was in the presidency, but the kinds of actions that were taking place in the streets, in grassroots movements, in the labor movement. The 30s, of course, saw these massive upsurges. 1934, multiple general strikes in Toledo, Ohio, and Minneapolis and San Francisco, and all kinds of disruptive labor organizing happening all across the country, to the point that elites were really terrified that we were going to see some kind of, Russian Revolution style overthrow of the existing order. Similarly, obviously, in the 60s, with the civil rights movement, with the student movement, with the anti-war movement, there was this widespread ferment in the streets that pushed that social change into happening. Of course, we're in a slightly different moment right now in that we don't have anything like those 30s era union organizing or 60s era civil rights movement, although we're seeing some signs of, a rejuvenated labor movement. I'm in Chicago where there's a teacher strike. We might hear the teachers actually march by my apartment while we're in this conversation. So there's some signs. And of course, the Democratic Socialists of America, which I'm a member of, is sort of like rejuvenated left energy. But we don't have anything like what we had in the 30s and the 60s and early 70s. And to me, Bernie's campaign represents almost kind of a attempt to reverse engineer reverse engineer that kind of movement, street level, grassroots level energy that we had in those eras. Like, we don't have that happening right now. And so Sanders says, his campaign slogan is "Not me, us." And he's using his campaign infrastructure, as we've seen, to turn people out to picket lines, to have striking workers speak at his rallies, to send his supporters in a given geographic area to strikes and to other kinds of protests. And he's saying that, we're not going to be able to accomplish any of the big stuff that I want to accomplish without building those kinds of mass movements. So his campaign represents, to me, certainly the best chance that we have to actually to build those movements. We would have a president in the White House through Sanders who would actually want to use his position to build those things and sees that as the way that we change the world. That's unlike anything that we've ever seen, even in those movements, those moments of mass upsurge that we've seen in the past in the U.S. And to me, that is how social change happens, is through that kind of momentum at the grassroots level and the street level. This is what socialists and progressive sort of like labor movement types and other people who are involved in grassroots movements have long said is what really matters is affecting that kind of mobilized movement to change the world, and Bernie's campaign represents our best hope for creating that.
Mm-hmm. So a couple things. So, not me, us that's a good slogan. That's definitely better than I'm with her, which was a bad slogan. And I mean, how did they not think to
not
do
us, her? Yeah, that's basically what.
How did they not think to do she's with me instead of I'm with her? I'll never know. Any campaigns who want to hire me on that, based on that possible slogan, just DMs are open. But okay, so yeah, so I mean, there does seem to be some sort of the labor movement, after being like battered, for half a century or more, does seem to be reviving in some small way, or reversing some of these things. It's mostly public employees, but there was the strike at GM as well that seemed to be successful. So yeah, something's happening there. I mean, there's also we have seen mass protest movements spring up in the age of Trump. I attended some of these marches. The Women's March was reportedly the largest protest in American history. The March for Science as well, and then the March for Our Lives, I think it was called, that's started by the students in Parkland. So there's these individual kind of movements, like they haven't congealed as far as I know, and there's been controversies around some of these. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely like the spirit of taking to the streets is definitely been revived in the Trump era. I can see that. I guess I've seen this idea, especially on Twitter, that we need change only happens through mass movements, and Bernie is like leading or trying to lead a mass movement. And my response is like, well, he's at 16% in the polls. Is Joe Biden leading a mass movement? He's at 34, according to the CNN poll. So those people probably aren't marching in the streets. But if Bernie is in second or third place in the Democratic primary, then how could he lead a true mass movement that is going to change the shape of the country, when he's, you have to win the Democratic primary first, and he's not cruising to victory right now.
Well, sure. I mean, polls are up and down; they're changing all the time, and yeah, he's in most polls he's not in first place. Biden is. I think at this point that might be in part because I feel like we don't hear a lot of news from Biden on the campaign trail lately. I think they're keeping him hidden away from voters.
That would be a smart move.
Yeah, exactly. So he doesn't stick his foot in his mouth some more, or some other body part doesn't, do something that's not supposed to. But no, of course, I mean, he's making a case to the American people, and not everybody is buying the case, or not everybody's even heard that case yet. I mean, I went to the post office today to mail the other day, not today, to mail a bunch of things out, and the person at the post office asked me, "Are these invitations to something?" And I said, "No, they were stickers that I had printed of Bernie's tweet that said, if there's going to be class war in this country, it's about time the working class won that war." And so I mentioned to this person that it was tweeted from Bernie Sanders. And she said, "Who's that?" And I was like, Bernie Sanders? You didn't hear it? And she's like, she had no idea who Bernie Sanders was. So,
really? Okay.
Yeah, I mean, she was intrigued when I described him. But, there's still people like that who are not like you and me, who eat, sleep, and breathe on Twitter, who haven't made up their minds yet. But your point is well taken, that he's not in first place in the polls. I mean, to me, whatever, this is what the primary process is for, is for introducing these people and their ideas to the American people. And it takes a while for those ideas to sort of trickle down to the average voter, and for name recognition to build and all that stuff. I mean, for me, I guess that my starting point is more like that. For years, decades, we didn't think that we thought that socialism was this dirty word, that if you touched it, you would turn to stone or whatever, that the worst thing in the world you could possibly be was to be a socialist and to have a vision of the world, to openly proclaim a vision of the world that looked radically different from the one that we live in. And in Bigger Than Bernie, this book that I'm working on with Megan Day, I write in the intro about how as someone who's considered myself a socialist for a decade and a half at this point, I sort of believed that line that the American people would never buy. I was a socialist because I thought it was the right thing to do, but it wasn't like I ever thought that my politics would ever have mass purchase in American society. And what we learned from Bernie's 2016 campaign and then now is that actually there are millions of people who are very much interested in a completely different kind of politics than the one we're used to, one that makes these sort of unapologetic, bold demands for Medicare for all, for free college tuition, public college tuition. And so to me, obviously there's sort of horse racy up and downs in the polls, and Bernie's not on top now. He could be later. Biden could win the whole thing. But the sort of bigger lesson from what's happened over the last couple of years is just the basic lesson that there actually is some hunger in America right now for those kinds of transformative, working class politics, politics that wants to really change the way that society is run in a fundamental way and not tinker around the edges. And then at the same time, we've also learned, of course, that like the polar opposite of that can also have a great deal of purchase, that Trump's, right-wing, xenophobic, erratic, bizarre populism can also have mass purchase. And so I guess what I'm saying is that both there is clearly a hunger for my kind of politics, at least in a broad sense, and that politics is up against, it's up against the right-wing populism that seems to be also on the rise here and abroad. And I would, venture to say that our kind, that Bernie's kind of bold left-wing politics is a better way to defeat the noxious right-wing populism that we see ascendant elsewhere than a kind of tepid centrism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I would just note, in 2016, Bernie benefited by getting the anti-Clinton vote within the Democratic Party. He was the alternative. There were a couple other people running, but they were jokes. And so I feel like
don't speak ill of Lincoln Chafee.
Right, Lincoln Chafee. Was Jim Webb actually running? I can't even remember. Anyway, Martin O'Malley, that was that other guy who Matt Iglesias was a big fan of. But so he ended up getting 45% or something like that of the vote. But I think that mandate was overinterpreted by some because, well, as you said, he's somewhere between 15 and 20 or so currently in the polls. And there were a lot of people. I think many people didn't either like inside or outside the Democratic Party didn't understand in 2015 how many people out there in the voting public did not like Hillary Clinton and really wanted to vote against her. And so that helped Trump and it helped Bernie as well. I think Bernie has showed, and the growth of DSA has showed that it's not being labeled a socialist is not the thing that's going to get you laughed off the stage in the way maybe it would have 20 years ago. And there's some percentage of the population that appeals to. I feel like if America was like a parliamentary system, then there would be like a socialist party that maybe got 15% of the vote or something regularly, and then like a center left party, maybe Mayor Pete would be in charge of it, and that would get like 35% of the vote or something. But we're stuck with this,
as well as like a party of capital that it was on its own, and then sort of a party of the sort of hard right populist sort of xenophobic stuff. Like that, we'd probably have a whole bunch of other kind of parties. Yeah,
the alliance, the classic conservative alliance with the three legs of the stool, the foreign policy hawks and the low tax people and the religious right, was a marriage of convenience, as I think Trump has showed, and maybe they would have, in a parliamentary system, they would splinter into some sort of different configuration. And who knows which party Trump would belong to in that system. Probably not the religious right one, even though they love him. We're stuck with this two-party system, as the Simpsons Treehouse of Horror episode put it, about 30 years ago. And, how can we, I think, would you agree with me that less than 50% of the people who consider themselves Democrats are would also consider themselves leftist or socialist or however you want to label it?
Oh, of course. I mean, we haven't won hegemony yet. Jacobin's traffic is pretty good these days, but we're not, we're not quite there yet.
So it's a matter of time.
But of course, that's been true in most countries around the world. Socialists, there are some examples, Chile, where the socialists, as part of a broad left coalition, won the presidency in 1970. But like most of the time, in even countries where socialists have had significant influence, they haven't been, won the majority of their population over to, call themselves, socialists. Like say, yes, I am a socialist, and here is what being a socialist means to me in a coherent and, sensible way. I mean, it's more about sort of injecting these broad socialist ideas into the body politic that actually have some purchase from people.
Mm-hmm. Okay, when Bernie says I'm a socialist, does he mean the same thing that you mean when you say I'm a socialist?
Broadly, I think. Well, I mean, so I guess this is a question that comes up a lot. It's sort of like, is Bernie a real socialist? Like when he gave his democratic socialism speech, a lot of people were, saying, wait a minute, this guy's just talking about, FDR and the New Deal. And he's not talking about any, this is not, when I look up the Wikipedia definition of socialism or Marxism or whatever, this is clearly not what Bernie is saying from his bully pulpit. I think I read, I believe it was Lenin who once said that like there's no such thing as a sort of inherently radical politics. The radicality of a policy or of a strategy is all context dependent, right? So what is unique about Bernie is not that he is sort of like there is a set socialist program and he is up there reciting chapter and verse every day, every single facet of that program. He is sort of looking at the American scene and with all of its shortcomings in whether it's the arcane and undemocratic political system that we have, or some reactionary ideas that some Americans might hold, whatever. He is sort of looking at that and figuring out how to advance a broad left-wing politics in that context that makes sense, that people actually buy into. I mean, this is what he says all the time, right? Like when people ask him about being a socialist, he's like, well, is it radical to say that everybody deserves health care? Is it radical to say that everybody deserves free public college tuition? I mean, if that's radical, then I guess I am a radical, and I think that lots of other people in the United States are radicals too. Bhaskar Sankara, who was on Blogging Heads recently, who's the founder of Jacobin, coined this term in his book, The Socialist Manifesto, called class struggle social democracy, which is that, social democracy, policies that put a check on the free market, things like, Medicare for all is like a social democratic policy, or, the Nordic countries that have really robust welfare states. Those are social democracies with strong social democratic politics. And social democracy has checks on the sort of worst of the free market, of capitalism, but it's still a society in which the capitalists are in charge. It's still a fundamentally capitalist society, just with greater public protections against the depredations of the market. And Bernie is largely putting forward social democratic policies that would not be particularly radical in different countries or in a different time in history. But what is radical about what he's doing is that he's not just saying, I think we need this stuff and I am the uniquely sort of moral and capable and smart guy to win you those things. He's saying that we need the class struggle part. He's saying that there needs to be sort of movement from below, mass movement of the working class and millions of people throughout society to win those things. And so that to me is why that question of like, is Bernie a real socialist? Is his socialism somehow different from me as a editor of a socialist magazine or whatever? I mean, we could have an interesting conversation about that, but to me the more important point is that he's using his campaign and fighting for these social democratic demands in a way that can put us, that can put millions of people into motion, that can build those mass movements, and that could potentially allow us to win something more in the future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, there's a counterfactual history where Obama in 2008 and 9 did not kind of stop paying attention to the millions of people who were energized by his campaign. Right. and what would have been possible if there was some sort of mass movement behind him in that period, because it really was mostly an inside game to get Obamacare passed and the financial reform stuff passed. Okay, so I'm skeptical, but if it happens, I'm interested.
Yeah, I don't know if you saw. I think it was Ryan Grimm in The Intercept the other day interviewed Sanders, or wrote an article about something Sanders said about how Obama had that idea of like, oh, there's millions of people in motion. He created Organizing for America, and it was going to be the way to sort of get grassroots energy to get his agenda through. And then, of course, he mothballed the thing for the most part. And so the article was in him talking to Sanders, and Sanders saying, like, I'm not going to make that mistake again if I win the presidency, to mothball that the energy that my campaign has unleashed. That's something that he says would be at the center of how he would conduct himself as president, which is obviously distinct from Elizabeth Warren's approach. I mean, there's the sort of the class struggle approach and the social democracy approach that are combined. And Elizabeth Warren has elements of that social democracy approach, but she certainly doesn't have that same class struggle approach towards winning the social democracy.
Mm-hmm. Okay, let's talk about Bernie the man for a few minutes. I mean, you mentioned that he doesn't want to be the the be all and end all, and you're writing a book about what happens after Bernie. But let's just we have a strange pathology in this country about the president being kind of like the universal daddy and God figure and biggest celebrity in the country, and Obama had that in many ways, and Trump has just turned it into this funhouse kind of craziness reality TV show. But okay, so Bernie, is he 77? Is that right?
I think he just turned 78, if I'm not mistaken. Okay,
so he's in his late 70s. He recently had a heart attack or 2 heart attacks. Seems to have bounced back very quickly and recovered.
Wait, 2 heart attacks? I've never heard.
Oh, I thought maybe he had 2 blockages. Maybe I'm wrong about that. Okay, he had a serious heart problem, but within like a week and a half, he was back on the debate stage. Seemed to be fine. Seemed to be his old self. But obviously, he is old. Now, does that matter? Well, Trump is old. He's 72 or so, 73 maybe. And Biden is around the same age. And Warren is 70, I think. So all these, the 4 most likely people probably to be the next president are all 70 or above. Some of them are clearly experiencing some form of cognitive decline, I would say.
Yeah, I was going to say, of the top of the 3 oldest candidates, Bernie's brain is clearly functioning.
Yeah, so okay, I agree with that. He seems very sharp, whereas clearly Biden has lost a step and is kind of just fumbling around, doesn't really, start talking and then start saying things that make any sense. And then, Trump, who knows what's wrong with his brain, but something is. And if you watch old clips of him, he makes much more sense, right, and he can speak in paragraphs. And now, he's just a doddering old grandpa. Okay, so on the one hand, like, can we fucking get rid of these baby boomers and this gerontocracy that is like strangling the country? But we're stuck with these 4 people, seemingly. Mayor Pete, maybe he'll break through, probably not. But
he's got a good 40 years for us to see how he's going to be with us for the rest of our lives.
Yeah, that's a good point. So there's just the age factor, which is, I think, inescapable, but also like it's not like Trump could use the age factor against Bernie because he's like 4 or 5 years older at most. But these old people, they can just have a heart attack and die at any moment. And then there's also like Bernie's persona, and so I watched not the most recent debate after the heart attack, but the one before that. I actually don't like watching the debates. And I don't have cable TV, and I don't like watching videos on Twitter because they're annoying to watch. So I rarely actually see any of these people, in like moving around, in video. And so I was at my mother's house, where I actually am right now, and, they have cable and they have, a high def TV also. And so it was my first time seeing the full crowd, in action, high def. Okay, Biden did not come off very well in high def. Like, whatever he's done to his face didn't look good. I honestly thought, I had seen Bernie, like, from 2016. I honestly thought he came off as crazy. Like, he was right off the bat angry and pointing at the camera and seemingly, like, in a rant from the very beginning. I thought Warren, whatever her makeup job is, like, came off well. and some of the other ones less, more or less well. But of the three, I thought Warren came off well. Now, does this matter? Trump paints himself orange and has a bizarre manner and way of speaking, and his brain is going to continue to decline, the next year before the election. So does this kind of thing matter? It's going to be, two old decaying brains up on stage. Does any of this matter at all? And then okay, one of them is going to win. And then, if Bernie serves the full term, then he's 82 at the end of the term. And does he want to run again at that point? Like they always seem to, who was the last one who decided not to after the end of one term? It'd be James K. Polk or something. And yeah, so then he's 86. Do we want a president to be 86 years old? So, I mean, do you have any thoughts on all this craziness?
Well, just on the age question, I mean, age is relative, right? I mean,
it's just a number.
It's just a number, as somebody once said. He clearly, as we've said, he clearly has the sort of he's sharp. He's even after a heart attack, he's out there fighting. I mean, to me, this stuff is not something that I worry about particularly, just because he clearly is in good health and is in his, he's functioning well, and he has more energy certainly than I do as a 31-year-old. I couldn't handle his schedule that he's on. I mean, more important is that he's the only one who's putting forward this kind of transformative agenda, and so he's the only one who I would back. I mean, he's the only one whose politics have the potential to transform the country, in my opinion. And you mentioned during the debate that you didn't like him sort of coming off. That is a
wait. Sorry, you broke off.
Clearly, that's something that
you broke off for 1 second there on my end. So can you just repeat that?
Oh yeah, which?
So I was watching, so the debate and Bernie pointing at the camera and that stuff.
Oh yeah, so you mentioned not liking seeing his finger pointy, angry demeanor and stuff. Clearly, that has some purchase among people, voters, because he keeps doing fairly strong numbers for this point in the primary, and he seems to tap into a real anger that people have about the state of affairs in the country right now. That people appreciate the sort of angry grandpa who refuses a combination sort of angry old grandpa and Old Testament prophet. It was things are really bad, and I'm going to point my finger and yell and raise my voice until it's hoarse to talk about how bad they are. I don't think, I mean, I'm from the Midwest, I get uncomfortable when people start yelling. I didn't hear a lot of yelling growing up. I still find my parents are always I love Bernie, but why is he yelling like that? But I think it speaks to that level of anger. I mean, it's just it reflects the dire state of affairs in American politics, of what's going on with the climate, of endless wars, of crushing student debt, crushing medical debt, and a private medical system that's not serving people's needs. I mean, all of it sort of reflects that, and I think he's tapped into that, and people agree with it on at least a sort of gut level. And as I mentioned before, I think that is the kind of response that we need to a right-wing populism that clearly has no qualms about doing the same thing. I mean, if in terms, maybe some of the sort of genteel, professional class Democratic voters get along with the Midwesterners like my parents don't like the yelling, but clearly people didn't have any problem with the kind of just horrific remarks that Trump made and continues to make. There's still large numbers of people who back that, and there were enough to get an elected president. So
right.
I don't think,
which was a minority, as we all know, but
course,
but talk as if it weren't. I mean, yeah. So in some ways, it's okay. Was Trump this clearly unqualified buffoon character winning a fluke? Or did it say, okay, the rules have changed, we're in some sort of different era, Obama was never mad. I mean, there's a racial part
right.
to his expression of anger, but he was always very calm,
Sure.
I can't remember him yelling about anything ever, whereas Trump is mad constantly because he's an old person who's watching Fox News all the time, and he gets riled up and fires off a tweet. So, do people want that kind of anger? People on the right wanted that kind of anger, but do people on the left want that kind of anger? Like, yeah, most people, I don't know, like, that kind of frothing. I mean, Bernie's not frothing, but that kind of like emotional demonstrativeness, like, hasn't been seen on the left among a leader in a long time. And I mean, I think there's like I said, there's this pathology in the country about like the president is our like elected monarch, father figure. We think about him constantly. We're always saying his name. So he's in our lives all the time. And, what after the craziness of Trump, I honestly think like, I mean, one of the reasons that like Biden would win against Trump is that people are just tired of the craziness. They want a return to normalcy. And just like, can we just not pay attention to politics anymore and get back to our regular lives and like, not be fighting with our cousins and always like scared to turn on the news and see what the latest thing is. Just like do the boring things that like you're supposed to do and let us forget about it for most of our lives. Like, I think that's a very appealing message to most people, to the regular people who think about politics very little, like feel like they need to vote because it's their civic duty, but are not in the weeds, not obsessed with it, don't watch MSNBC or Fox or anything. So, yeah, I don't know.
I mean, I think that it is certainly possible that someone like Biden could win up against Trump. I mean, I wouldn't say that wouldn't happen. Maybe the sense of being driven totally insane since 2017 with the just daily madness that comes out of the White House is enough to get people to want to get rid of Trump. But in terms of building the kind of long-term political coalition, with bringing on, working class voters, with going beyond what has become the sort of typical milieu of the Democratic Party at this point, like bringing back in a sort of large percentage of working class voters into the fold, and to try to create the coalition and to try to create the kind of movements over the long term that can transform American society. I mean, certainly Biden is not going to bring us that.
No.
So, it might be possible. I have some doubts. I thought for sure that Clinton was going to win in 2016. And obviously, I was proven wrong about that. But Biden could potentially win in 2020. But what I'm worried about is the squandering of that energy right when it feels like we might be on the precipice of creating something larger in American politics that could bring about the kinds of dire transformations that we really, really need right now in climate and everything else. And Sanders' campaign represents the best opportunity that we have to do that, to build it over the long term. And I think, obviously this weekend the news came out that Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez and Ilhan Omar, and I think soon to be Rashida Tlaib, endorsed Sanders, which I was really on the edge of my seat about seeing if that was going to happen. And on sort of my darker days was worried that it definitely wasn't going to happen. And then all of a sudden they all come out and do this. And to me, that helps. I mean, somebody like me was banking on the ability of Bernie to affect a longer-term transformation of American politics. And I think the way that the Democratic Socialists of America, for example, have grown because of his campaign, in large part because of his campaign, like that's what that growth represents. Like long-term, maybe this could be a sort of source of activist energy, maybe even some people running for elected office. So we saw some movement in that direction. But with the endorsement of the three of them, now it feels like, okay, we have the sort of electoral basis for a long-term, left project in American politics. Like whether or not Bernie wins the nomination and wins the presidency in 2020, we were starting to cohere a group of people around this sort of like DSA-like agenda. Mm-hmm. That it's obviously, like we can imagine somebody like AOC running for president when she is of age to do so, or Omar getting elected to Senate and just continuing to rise, their stature continuing to rise in American politics. And so we're sort of seeing the beginnings of that, both the sort of like activist level, there's the activist base through something like DSA, and then there are the sort of like political electoral representatives in Ocasio-Cortez and Omar and Tlaib, and others who are running for office in this cycle and who have already won. That is starting to be built. So that gives me even more optimism about the ability for that kind of radical politics to actually catch hold in American society.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that Ocasio-Cortez and Omar did endorse Bernie and did it in the manner and time that they did it. I mean, they could have. I think you would agree with me that it's a less than 50% chance that Bernie wins the primary. So they're playing against the odds. If they wanted to just sit on their hands, they could have. They probably would have been pressured to endorse someone. You could easily see them, I think, endorsing Warren instead. And
sure, yeah.
So the fact that they did decide to make a huge splash and endorse Bernie, so they're laying their chips with him, but also I think looking towards the future and saying if not this time, then in some future time, people will remember that we did this, and it'll help us if any of them want to be senators or president or whatever. Okay, let me. Can
I just go ahead. Just real quickly on that question? I think it would have been, from a sort of purely careerist perspective, that would have been the move to make, either endorse Warren or. I don't know if you read the Politico article that explained the backstory of the Ocasio-Cortez endorsement. She called Bernie literally when he was in the hospital after he had the heart attack, and said that she was going to endorse him while he was laying in the hospital bed, which to me is almost like a. She felt she had to get right with God or something before, because she didn't know maybe Bernie Sanders is about to die in this hospital bed, and she pledges him this endorsement at that moment. And so to me, that indicates that this is somebody who's not just worried about their political prospects for the future and sort of ingratiating themselves. Maybe there's a new left-wing energy within the Democratic Party, but I'm going to sort of play in a safer lane within that, which I would consider to be the Warren wing, is people, we're going to make some changes in this party, but we're not going to burn the whole thing down. Yeah. She clearly in that moment felt no, I have to stick with Sanders, and just in terms of somebody who wants to keep winning office and rise in the party, that would have been a smarter move. And so it indicates that those figures are up to something else. They're interested in doing something else with their political careers, and that seems more in line with that kind of Sanders-like politics and building that kind of movement that people like me are hoping come out of his candidacies.
Yeah, and I mean, AOC, is such a star and is so talented that she could, I think, write her ticket if she wanted to leave Congress. It has to be a pretty awful job being a representative in general. You have to hang out with all these stupid, awful people, your fellow representatives, and so she could, start some kind of organization or a media outlet or whatever if she wanted to, and people would want to see what she does. So she doesn't have to just be the careerist, doing what's expected of her to slowly move up the ranks or something. Okay, so I want to talk for a moment at least about kind of the way Warren versus Bernie is playing out online, and the various maybe true or false stereotypes about the type of people who support Senator Sanders. So I'm going to actually read to you a text message that I was talking to a friend, and I mentioned that I was taping this episode, and I jokingly said, so next time you talk to me, I might be a BernieBro. And she texted back the ghost screamy face and said, oh no. And she says, just kidding, I like a lot of things about Bernie, but some of his supporters are terrible. So, there was a debate whether, I think in 2016, whether the BernieBro even existed or not. I think that kind of type of person does exist. But, it's gotten, I don't know, Bernie supporters, at least online, have gotten a rap as being, misogynists, possibly racist, all sorts of bad things. And then there's also the kind of opinion leaders among a certain group of people on Twitter who are very pro Bernie, and he's be the Chapo Trap House hosts and people who are in like that, like dirtbag left media orbit, and then people who write for, Jacobin or Current Affairs or something. And yeah, so what do you think of this? That like, oh, I like Bernie, but his awful supporters, they're the worst.
This has become obviously a huge talking point, and it's one that, to me, is just designed to, fashion something to denigrate the movement that he's built, and it's one that doesn't bear any relation to what the actual polls show, or who is part of the sort of Sanders voter coalition. I mean, he's got a more working class voter base than anybody, or certainly than Warren. He has a more diverse voter base than Warren this time around, especially. The campaign is populated. It's a diverse campaign staff. I mean, like, clearly the numbers show that this sort of BernieBro smear is one that this just isn't reflected in reality. I think that anytime, I always find it bizarre that anyone wants to sort of like draw any kind of conclusions from like weirdos tweeting on the internet. Like, it's so easy on the internet to like screw with people, like to create your own Twitter account for whatever reason and pose as whoever you want and like wreak whatever kind of havoc and like call people kinds of names, like whatever. Like, that's the easiest thing in the world. Like, we have no idea who these people are. I mean, unless they're, somebody who's a prominent journalist or public figure or something, we don't really know who these people are on the internet. And so I just don't, the obsession with that is so bizarre to me. And it just seems to be one that's designed to write off the excitement of like a million. There's like, he's got more donors than anybody in American history ever has. He's got more small donations. Like, his whole campaign comes from grassroots support. Like, if that is your base of support, like, of course you are going to draw some like, eccentric people and people who are probably like rude to others on the internet. And I think, but that's like more of a reflection of the fact that he has just gotten normal people excited about his campaign, and there are normal people participating in the political discourse in this election cycle. So yeah, those are sort of the two pieces. Like, one, we don't know. For all we know, it could be like Biden staffers, like creating, these sort of BernieBro or die.
It could be the Russians. It could be
anybody. We have no clue who it is. But also, it's just a reflection that like when the rabble. I mean, that's what I feel like people don't like when the rabble are like involved in politics, and it makes them uncomfortable that they're not sort of like abiding by the norms of discourse that the rest of us in the kind of media sphere have all agreed to abide by for the most part. But yeah, I mean, but the more important answer is just in the polls. I mean, like that kind of like white male, that his entire voter base is made of white males just isn't borne out by the poll numbers.
Yeah, that's true. And Twitter has this weird distorting effect where, if there's 10 people who are kind of working either explicitly together or they just happen to all be doing the same thing and they're directing it at you at the same time, it can seem like, the world is like everyone in the world is rushing at you and trying to get you for something. I mean, I had a very early run-in with like alt-right Twitter trolls in like February 2016 before it was like widely known what these people were. I didn't know who they were. They were just sending me memes about like putting me in the gas chamber and stuff. So who were these people? We'll never really know. They all got banned. They did seem to be Donald Trump supporters, so we can say that. Like, I don't think it's like, obviously a politician who's getting millions of votes can't be responsible for really any of those people. And this is a huge country with plenty of psychos wrapped up in it. That being said, like the fact that the alt-right people were like, yeah, Trump is our guy, it turned out it did seem to indicate something about both Trump's appeal and, who he actually was. I don't know. I mean, if Bernie disproportionately attracts like white guys in their 20s who want to like fight with middle-aged moms on Twitter, then that kind of says something. I don't know, but I don't know what exactly. And yeah, the fact that all the media people are on Twitter makes things that happen there seem much more important than they are in real life.
Right, and I think that the overwhelming majority of his base of voters is from people who are not extremely online. I mean, that's what's so exciting about his campaign, is that he is, getting people who are not the political junkies who don't even necessarily vote in every election, right? I mean, that's an explicit part of his campaign strategy this time around, as it has been his entire career, which is to excite people who are not usually excited about politics by putting forward a different vision of the world than they hear from other elected candidates for elected office, and saying, like, I'm putting forward an agenda for you, and that's why you should be excited about my candidacy and vote for me. So he's like bringing people into the political process who haven't been brought into in the past. That's his wager. And again, to me, that is the sort of stuff of a longer term, transformative bottom up project. That is how we'll be able to affect that project.
If the nominee is Biden or Warren or one of the other cast of characters and not Bernie, will the people who are big Bernie fans now vote for that person against Trump?
I haven't looked at whatever the data shows on that. I'm sure there are polls out there that ask that question. I know that majority of people who, I think strong majority of people who voted for Sanders also voted for Clinton. Mm-hmm. I mean, I think the majority of people will do that. But the bigger question is, like, when people don't make their political decisions, whether who to vote for or whether to vote for at all, on purely rational calculus, right?
I agree with that.
Like people who are not, you and me especially, or maybe even us, maybe we're not fully rational either, but especially people who are not sort of like, spending every waking moment of their life thinking about politics. They make their political decisions based on, feelings and much less. They don't parse every piece of information and put it on a table, and then they say Bernie is pissed off and wants to burn down the system that has clearly not worked for people like me and for other people, and that's why I like him. And if I don't get somebody like that, then I don't want to vote for them. And we could tell them, we could wag our finger at them and lecture them about how that is not a rational and smart way to make political decisions. But it is also just a reality. I mean, we saw that in the last election, right? Like, there were lots of people who should have been, on paper should have been voting for Hillary Clinton, but were just sort of had this gut feeling against her and decided not to go to the polls. And, if I live in a safe blue state, I live in Illinois. If I lived in a swing state, I would have voted for Clinton. I would vote for whoever the Democrat is in 2020 if I lived in a swing state. But in terms of the energy around groups like Democratic Socialists of America, at the convention that I was elected delegate to this summer, the organization voted not to endorse anyone but Sanders. And that was because the organization wanted to plant a flag for a kind of politics and say that this is our baseline. We have to have people who will, both have a certain policy agenda when it comes to imperialism and war abroad and Medicare for all that stuff, but also have this class struggle orientation, this sort of using their candidacy to spark a bigger movement. And anything less than that, we as socialists are not going to get behind, which is obviously distinct from will socialists vote for a Warren or a Biden or whatever. But it's like, will the organization get behind that kind of politics? And so I think you're going to keep seeing people like, groups like the Democratic Socialists of America, certainly Jacobin. You'll see us continuing to insist that we need this kind of transformative politics for a long-term transformation of the United States. and we're not going to settle for anything less. And of course, that's what the right did, since Barry Goldwater, right? Like there's a far right, ran Goldwater and then continued to run, pretty farther and farther right candidates and drag the rest of the country with them rightward. It worked out pretty well for them to plant a flag and say, these are the core issues that we're not going to compromise on. Not just any Republican will do for us. We need somebody who's committed broadly to our program and can advance our program. And so I know this sort of drives a lot of people in the pundit class insane, but to me, it's the only way to advance a coherent politics and stick to it and like get it purchased over the long run.
Mm-hmm. We've gone a little over an hour. Maybe one more question, and then you can talk about your book project if you want to, which you're working on currently. How do you view Warren and so the sense I get from following lefties on Twitter is that people decided we got to take Warren down to occupy the left lane of the primary. So let's go at her with what we can. The Nathan, what's his name, who runs Current Affairs? Not Robinson.
Robinson, yeah.
Nathan Robinson. Okay, I was right. Posted these this cookbook, pages from this cookbook that she had participated, given a recipe to, that was called the Pow Wow Chow or something. Bringing up the whole Native American Pocahontas theme that Trump uses as his currently only card against Warren. Your co-author Megan Day, I also recall her making the case that the Pocahontas stuff should be taken seriously, and it's not just a smear, but there's something telling there. And then there's also just the larger critique of her from the left as being kind of not Hillary 2.0, but she's just another neolib, and she's not really going to change anything. She's cagey on Medicare for all, et cetera, et cetera. The view from I think either the right or the middle is Liz Warren, a leftist maniac. She wants to tear down capitalism. She's basically unacceptable. There's an episode of Blogging Heads that's going to go up very soon after we finish recording this, where Matt Lewis, conservative co-host of the DMZ, says, he's supporting Trump's impeachment, and he's a never Trumper, and he says, but if Warren is a nominee, then all bets are off, and the conservative people who are disaffected from Trump will come running back because Liz Warren is so scary to them. So these both can't be right, obviously. But what do you see? How does Warren? I mean, Warren, if Sanders weren't there, if Sanders, decided to retire to Vermont or something, then, would people on the left say okay, Warren, she's pretty good for now, we'll rally behind her, or would she be neoliberal shill? Pocahontas kind of thing. What do you think about this?
Well, there's a couple of different questions that are there. I mean, the sort of pow wow chow question is one that I think when people on the left like Nathan Robinson raise it, it's to say this is. Can you imagine what the general election would look like between Trump and Elizabeth Warren? And Trump is just going to talk about that incessantly. He's never going to stop talking about the supposed the first Native American professor at Harvard, all of that stuff. That's just stuff that is going to come up on the campaign trail. So and stuff that is just weird and that we're not really talking about that much in the primary right now. But to me, that's not the primary, the principal issue right now. I mean, the principal issue is more on the differences in politics. And certainly I would, I would much rather see a President Warren than a President Biden. I mean, she would be much to the left of most anybody who's occupied the presidency in the last century. But one issue is, as we were talking about before, that lack of a commitment to the class struggle piece of the class struggle social democracy, the missing movement piece, which is one of the principal reasons. That's a big thing that the book that we're working on is about that movement piece. There's also just that substantively there are some really very much key differences between Warren and Sanders. I mean, one of the most important is on foreign policy. I mean, Bernie has what I think is an anti-imperialist worldview. He thinks that the U.S. has often played a really destructive role around the world, whether it's fomenting coups in places like Iran and Guatemala and Chile, or the invasion of Iraq and Vietnam. I mean, in the 80s when he was a mayor, a staunch opposition to the U.S. intervention in Central America in the 80s and 90s. That is a worldview that I don't think Elizabeth Warren shares, because she, substantively, she's far from the most hawkish Democrat on foreign policy, but she is pretty much in the middle of the pack, which is a pretty strongly, strong commitment to the role of the U.S. in the world as this imperial policeman. And so, there are real substantive differences like that really matter. I mean, they're not just sort of like, on the foreign policy question, that's the difference between tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of people dying abroad as a result.
Yeah, and the president has much more unilateral power in the foreign policy realm, as Trump has shown, than they do in the domestic front, where you need to actually pass stuff through Congress.
And it's also that, like on questions, like you brought up the Medicare for All question, for example. I mean, it's not that I don't believe that Elizabeth Warren actually wants to win Medicare for All. It's that I don't think she is committed to doing what needs to be done to win it. Like I think in her mind she wants Medicare for all, although she's been really slippery on the campaign trail about it. But without that commitment to sort of a bigger movement, to sort of, as Bernie is always saying, taking on the health insurance executives, taking on the private healthcare companies, we're not going to get it. I'm worried that we would end up in a kind of like Obama-like scenario in which a president gets swept into office with all of this sort of progressive excitement behind them, and people think they're really going to transform the way that things work in this country, and then most of that energy ends up dissipating, and then people become disappointed and disillusioned, and some number of them end up going in the direction of a rising right-wing populism that says this Democrat, this progressive, promised you the world and then didn't deliver it, and so then they say, how about my agenda of right wing xenophobia and all kinds of awful things. So to answer your question, the sort of shortest form possible, President Warren would be good, would be better than the alternative. But the difference between her and Bernie in terms of how she sees the world, in terms of how she sees political change coming about, and in terms of where she actually stands on substantive issues like foreign policy or like how she's going to win Medicare for all. I mean, all of that stuff is a really big difference. It's not just sort of like stuff that you can hand wave away. There are substantive differences there, and I have a much stronger belief that Bernie would be able to would be willing. Both has stronger personal commitments to parts of a anti-imperialist and anti-climate change agenda, but also will be doing the things that need to be done in order to make that actually happen.
Mm-hmm. Let me just briefly prognosticate. I'm not a great prognosticator, as longtime viewers of the show will know. But I mean, I think if Bernie wins, he'll try to do Medicare for all, and it'll fail because Congress is very, very hard to pass anything through. If any of the other Democrats win, they will not do health care first. They'll focus on like immigration or climate as the first thing because their political advisors will tell them, like, look, we can improve Obamacare like through executive stuff and through the agencies, and it's just like a swamp, and you're just going to get like pulled under by any sort of healthcare push. Like Bernie believes fervently in this, so he will try it. The other ones won't try it, and will try something else. I have no idea if anything else will succeed. McConnell will just filibuster everything, and they're too chicken to get rid of the filibuster. Who knows? So a lot of failure. I anticipate. I mean, the other prediction I would make is I think whoever is nominated is going to beat Trump. I think he's much weaker than he seems, but I think it is going to be the next term whoever it is will be just a lot of like kind of stalemate stuff. But there's of course there's always new things happening all the time, and craziness. Hopefully less craziness than over the past couple of years.
Just before you move on, can I just say briefly that I understand the worry that you're articulating, but I do think that fundamental to Bernie's worldview is a less sort of static view of our politics. That there are things that we can do. Obviously, Mitch McConnell is Mitch McConnell. He's not going to not be Mitch McConnell. But in terms of other elected representatives, in terms of the conditions that all of us are operating in, there are ways to transform our society and our politics. He believes that that's through mass movements and through his sort of like uncompromising left-wing candidacy. And, you think about something like Medicare for All, like 10 years ago, who would have guessed, or even 6 years ago, who would have guessed that like this is where we are, where a majority of Americans now support this stuff. I think he believes in the ability to change the conditions under which politics happen through mass movements, and he sort of puts his hope in that. So that would be that argument for that politics is malleable, that people's political ideas are not fixed, and that they can shift in ways that we can't even comprehend necessarily right now.
Yeah, I don't know. I guess I'm naturally more pessimistic, and also, it's such a complex, weird, conservative system of government that we have that favors the small states, favors the rural areas, et cetera. If we did have some sort of political revolution to fundamentally change how we work, and we had a parliamentary system instead of a bicameral Congress and a prime minister instead of a president, then it would be easier to get big things done. But the system is just set up to prevent that from happening, and it's kind of a shitty system.
Kind of, yeah.
We're discovering. So changing the system seems very hard to me as well, but would maybe ultimately have bear fruit more than trying to work through this screwed up system. Okay, so why don't can you talk briefly about the book you're working on that you've mentioned a couple times?
Yeah, so I mentioned that it's co-authored with Megan Day, who's a Jacobin staff writer. It'll be published by Verso early next year. The title is Bigger Than Bernie, and it's I was working on it right up until the moment that we started doing this conversation. It is a number of things. I mean, I've gotten to a bunch of the themes so far already in this conversation about how what is so unique and remarkable about the Bernie campaign is not just the policy agenda that he's putting forward, but the sort of vision of change in society that he's putting forward. And so I talk about sort of what is unique about his candidacy. It's also, I think, the most comprehensive overview that exists yet of what the Democratic Socialists of America have actually done in American politics since 2016, since it was a sort of reborn organization. We talk a lot about DSA elected candidates, not just Bernie, but who is not a member of DSA, but of course people like Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, who is a member of DSA, but also the half a dozen city council members in the city of Chicago, where I live, who were elected to city council this year. Other campaigns that failed, but at the state level, like in the state assembly in California, but a broader kind of movement politics was born out of their campaigns. We talk about what exactly socialists or what exactly people who are inspired by the Bernie campaign should be doing. Beyond running more people for office, we talk about the labor movement, and we talk about fights for affordable housing, and how socialists and other activists should be involved in those movements, and how they're really tied up in they're of a piece with what is so important about the Bernie campaign is the way that it has sort of energized those movements. So we're trying to do a sort of overview of what we've learned from Bernie's two candidacies, what we've learned from the last couple of years of this upsurge in interest in membership in the DSA, what kind of grassroots movements have been kicked off over the last couple of years, what other ones could exist in the near future, and how all of that energy is what we need to save the planet from burning to a crisp and save, people from being, crushed by medical debt and student debt and all the rest of it. So the title of the book is Bigger Than Bernie: How We Go from the Sanders Campaign to Democratic Socialism, and Verso's publishing it in early 2020.
Okay, cool. Maybe you and or Megan can come back on when that book comes out and talk about it some more. So I think you did not convince me to vote for Bernie if the election were today, but you did give me a lot of interesting stuff to think about, and hopefully our viewers and listeners had some also received some interesting thoughts from this conversation. So
if you don't change your mind in the next 24 hours, I'm going to be ceaselessly attacking you on Twitter.
Right.
As a true Bernie bro.
Right. So everyone, be safe out there from the BernieBros on Twitter or if they approach you on the street. And so Micah, thank you for coming on and taking the time. And thank you to our viewers and listeners, and we'll see you again next time.
Happy to be here. Thanks.